Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us.
It's great to be back.
Today, we're going to be diving into a pretty compelling topic, I think.
Yeah.
It's this question of whether religion is really the source of moral progress.
Right.
We've got some excerpts from the audiobook, Why Religion is Not the Source of Moral Progress, to guide our conversation today.
Okay.
So we'll be kind of pulling out, the main points,
Yeah.
highlighting some interesting insights,
Mm-hmm.
and then, we want to see what you, the listener, take away from this whole exploration.
Right.
I mean, it's something that's been debated for centuries, really.
Definitely.
This whole idea of, where morality comes from
Yeah.
and what role religion plays.
Yeah.
So I think it would be really interesting to see how this material kind of challenges that assumption that's been,
Yeah.
really ingrained in our culture for so long.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to see how this material challenges that deep-seated assumption that religion holds a monopoly on morality.
Yeah, it's true. Like, for so long, religion has dominated the conversation
Yeah.
about right and wrong,
Absolutely.
what's good, what's bad.
Mm-hmm.
But the author's suggesting that that link, between religion and morality
Yeah.
might be more about religion's historical power
Yeah.
and not necessarily some, inherent ability to drive moral progress.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like they invented morality.
Yeah, that's precisely the point that the
Yeah,
author's making.
Like the author was saying, they held the microphone for so many years.
Right.
They were shaping the conversation, but that doesn't make them the source of it.
Right.
It's like saying because the sun rises in the east, it causes the rooster to crow.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
That makes you think twice about assuming causation, just because two things are,
Right.
often linked together.
Yeah.
So now the author does acknowledge the good that religion has done.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, there are so many charities and social justice movements
Mm-hmm.
that have been inspired by faith,
Mm-hmm.
right? Think about food banks, disaster relief. I mean, they're on the front lines of that.
Right. And then historically,
Yeah.
the abolition of slavery,
Yeah.
the civil rights movement,
Dude.
these massive movements that have had such a positive impact,
Yeah.
were really driven by religious groups.
Absolutely. Religious organizations have been instrumental in countless acts of charity. And then,
Yep.
like you said, social justice issues. Think about the abolition of slavery and the civil rights movement.
You can't ignore that. And people like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
drew immense strength
Yeah.
and inspiration from their faith.
Mm-hmm.
And, even Carl Sagan,
Oh,
who was a noted scientist and skeptic,
Right.
even he acknowledged
Yeah.
the power of religious groups to mobilize for
Yeah.
good,
Mhm.
and to really make a difference.
For sure.
But then the author throws in this really thought-provoking counterpoint,
Right.
right?
Right. You're like, wait a minute.
Uh-huh.
Let's not forget about the dark side
Yeah.
of religion.
Yeah, there's a dark side.
And they remind us of all the atrocities
Yeah.
committed in the name of faith.
All those horrific acts.
I mean, we're talking about the Crusades,
Oh, yeah.
the Inquisition,
The witch hunts.
the witch hunts,
Yeah.
wars of religion,
Mm,
Yeah. And even today,
yeah.
religiously motivated violence and terrorism.
Unfortunately, we still see it.
It's a chilling reminder that religion hasn't always been a force for good.
They point to the dark side of religion, reminding us that there were atrocities that have been committed in the name of faith.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about things like the Crusades, the Inquisition, the witch hunts.
Yeah, it's hard to reconcile
Yeah.
those horrific acts,
Mm-hmm.
with the idea that religion is this,
Yeah.
sole driver of morality.
Wow.
It seems contradictory.
That's exactly their point.
Right.
They're saying if religion was the only source of morality,
Yep.
we wouldn't see these.
Really stark contrast
Right.
between good and bad.
Yeah. So how do we explain that then?
Well, it raises questions about love thy neighbor.
Okay. So they're saying love thy neighbor doesn't really mean what we think it means.
That's exactly what they're saying.
Okay.
They do a deep dive into the anthropological roots of that phrase, and it turns out that it was only meant for people within your own group.
Oh, so it was about the in-group,
Right.
not universal compassion.
Exactly.
So love thy neighbor had a much narrower meaning in its original context.
Right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how does that relate back to
Yeah.
the dark side of religion that we were just talking about?
Well, they juxtapose these feel-good verses about loving your neighbor with Moses' commands regarding the Midianites,
Okay.
where he orders the Israelites to slaughter the men, kill all the non-virgin women,
Oh, wow.
but keep the virgin girls for themselves.
That's a disturbing
It is.
contrast. It certainly highlights the complexities and contradictions within these religious texts.
Yeah.
And it raises the question of how we as individuals in society reconcile these inconsistencies,
Yeah. Yeah.
Do we just pick and choose the parts we like and ignore the parts that are inconvenient?
Yeah.
Or do we try to look at it from a historical and cultural perspective
Yeah.
and try to make sense of it that way?
That's a really important question to ask.
Yeah, it is.
Because I think, often we do tend to just kind of cherry pick
Yeah.
the parts that we like
Yeah.
and ignore the parts
Exactly.
that are a little more uncomfortable or challenging.
Yeah.
So another point the author brings up
Yeah.
is this idea that religion can be really slow to change.
Oh, yeah. Notoriously slow to change.
Right.
You know?
Which kind of makes sense when you think about it.
Well, I mean, if your emphasis is on absolute truth and you don't have a method for updating your beliefs,
Right.
it can be difficult, right?
Right.
To kind of shift with the times.
And they use Mormonism as a great example
Yeah, they do.
to illustrate this point.
Mm.
So, they talk about how Mormonism's stance on polygamy
Yeah.
and racial restrictions evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
But what was interesting to me
Yeah.
was that they highlighted how those changes were really driven by
Yeah.
external pressures.
Yeah.
Like the U.S. government basically saying, listen,
Yeah.
if you want statehood,
Got to get rid of polygamy.
you got to get rid of polygamy.
Yeah.
And then, the growing civil rights movement,
Right.
which obviously put pressure on their racial restrictions.
The author highlights how external pressures like the U.S. government and the civil rights movement forced these changes. So
Yeah.
it really makes you wonder, were those really revelations from God, or were they just kind of catching up with the times?
Right. It makes you think.
Yeah.
And then the author just kind of throws this bomb out there.
Yeah.
They say that the Bible is one of the most immoral works in literature,
That's a bold statement.
which is like, whoa,
Yeah.
hold on a minute.
Yeah.
That's a pretty provocative statement to make.
It is.
But why would they say something like that?
Well, it's a deliberate attempt to make the listener kind of question their own assumptions about the Bible's moral authority,
Okay.
and then they go on to list a bunch of problematic passages.
Okay, give me some examples.
Well, they start by pointing out that God punishes women just for being women.
You're talking about Eve, being punished with pain and childbirth and being subservient to Adam.
Yeah, and then there's the Great Flood, wiping out almost all life on Earth.
Oh, yeah.
And then polygamy, slavery, and violence.
Yeah, they talk about King Solomon,
Yeah.
having 700 wives.
That's 700 wives.
And then those brutal conquest instructions, in Deuteronomy,
right.
where God's telling the Israelites to show no mercy
Yeah.
to their enemies.
Yeah, and they even share some humorous takes on biblical morality from comedian Julia Sweeney's monologue, where she talks about, if you grab a man's, private parts while he's fighting your husband,
Right.
you get your hand chopped off.
Yeah. It's like both hilarious and horrifying
Exactly.
at the same time.
Yeah.
And then they bring in Richard Dawkins,
Oh, yeah.
Right?
They do.
who, calls the God of the Old Testament
Yeah.
a jealous, vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser.
That's a pretty harsh assessment.
It's pretty intense.
But it does make you think, right?
It does. It makes you think.
About the image of God that's being presented in those texts.
Yeah, for sure.
And, while many Christians argue that Jesus brought a new, more compassionate message,
Right.
Love and forgiveness.
Right. Like he's the kinder, gentler
Yeah.
God.
But the author challenges that notion as well.
Okay. How do they counter that?
Well, they show how Jesus actually reinforces the Old Testament law
Okay.
in many instances.
Interesting.
And he even elevates the concept of thought crimes.
You're talking about, lusting in your heart being equivalent to adultery.
Exactly.
Right.
And, plucking out your eye
Right.
if it causes you to sin.
And forsaking your family to follow Jesus?
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, hold on.
Yeah.
This is getting pretty intense.
Yeah. It is.
So we've seen some of the ways the Bible's morality might not be as straightforward as some people think.
Yeah.
And then the author moves on to debunk another common claim that gets thrown around a lot,
Okay.
which is that Christianity is like single-handedly responsible for the achievements of Western civilization.
Right. Right.
Have you ever heard that argument?
Now, all the time?
It's a pretty popular one.
Yeah.
And the author specifically addresses the claims made by Dinesh D'Souza in his book, What's So Great About Christianity?
Okay.
And, D'Souza, he paints this picture of Western Civ as like a shining city on a hill,
Right.
built on Christian values.
Yeah.
He attributes Western art music institutions all to Christian inspiration. But isn't that a bit of a stretch? I mean, there were thriving civilizations long before Christianity came along.
The author points out that ancient Greece and Rome, for example, made significant contributions to art, philosophy, government, all without the influence of Christianity.
Right, and think about it. If artists are working in a predominantly Christian society,
Yeah.
wouldn't it be natural for them to produce art with Christian themes?
Ah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that Christianity is the source of artistic inspiration.
Right. It's like they were working within that framework, so obviously it's
Right.
going to be reflected in their work.
It's a product of their time.
Yeah.
So the author's basically saying D'Souza's making a classic correlation-causation error
Right.
just because two things exist together.
Doesn't mean one caused the other.
That's a really important point to remember.
Yeah.
Not just when we're talking about religion and morality, but like in any area of life where we're trying to make sense of complex relationships.
Yeah, for sure.
So then the author moves on to another area where religion's influence is often debated,
Okay.
and that's capitalism,
Capitalism.
the economic system.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's their take on the connection between those two, religion and capitalism?
They examine the argument put forth by Rodney Stark in his book, The Victory of Reason.
Okay.
Stark basically links the rise of capitalism to the Christian work ethic.
Oh, okay. So that familiar idea that like hard work,
Yeah.
material success are signs of God's favor.
Exactly.
You've definitely heard that before.
Yeah.
But does the author find it convincing?
Well, they counter Stark's argument by pointing to examples like the Byzantine Empire,
Okay.
which was a Christian society but didn't develop capitalism in the same way as the West.
That's a good point. It seems a bit ironic,
Yeah.
considering what Jesus actually taught
Yeah.
about wealth.
Right.
But he wasn't exactly praising the rich and powerful.
No, not at
Not
all.
really.
In fact, they point out verses where Jesus talks about, a rich man entering heaven, the importance of giving to the poor woes pronounced upon the wealthy.
So the image of Jesus, like being a champion of unbridled capitalism,
Yeah.
seems a bit off,
A little bit.
doesn't it?
It's definitely more complicated than just saying Christianity equals capitalism.
Right. It's more nuanced than that.
For sure.
Okay, so moving on to another hot button issue.
Yeah.
What about religion and equal rights?
Okay.
Where does the author stand on that?
Well, they argue that the Bible itself doesn't offer a strong endorsement of equal rights as we understand them today.
Okay.
They revisit D'Souza's work again,
Okay.
and they talk about how he uses Galatians 3.28.
Right.
There is neither Jew nor Greek slave, nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
Right.
He uses that as evidence that Christianity promotes equality.
But, I mean, isn't that kind of misleading? Because didn't Paul, the same author of that verse, also advocate for slaves obeying their masters?
That's exactly what they point out. They're like,
Yeah.
wait a minute, let's look at the historical context here. Paul wasn't actually calling for, a revolutionary overthrow of the social hierarchy.
Right.
His message was more about spiritual equality, in the eyes of God.
Oh, so equality in the afterlife.
Right.
Not necessarily equal rights and opportunities in this
They
life.
highlight the irony of attributing the modern concept of equal rights to a book that was used to justify slavery and the subjugation of women for centuries.
It's like, whoa.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on.
It is.
A minute.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a powerful reminder that our interpretations of religious texts
Yeah,
can change dramatically over time.
they do.
Right.
And often in response to, evolving social norms.
Right, because like what was acceptable,
Yeah.
hundreds of years ago
Right.
is obviously not acceptable now.
Right.
So it's like we can't just take these ancient texts at face value.
Yeah.
We have to consider the historical context, the author's intent, and, our own evolving moral understanding.
Exactly.
So now the author kind of tackles the big question. Is religion actually good for society
Right.
as a whole?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like a question with no easy answers.
It is a very complex issue, and they do a good job of presenting both sides of the argument.
Okay, so what's the first side?
Well, they start by examining the work of Arthur C. Brooks, who wrote Who Really Cares?
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that book. Didn't he find that conservatives and religious people are more charitable?
He presented data showing that, Conservatives donate more money, they volunteer more time, give more blood.
So they're more outwardly charitable.
It seems that way.
But I know you said there's another side of this argument.
There is.
So what does the opposing research say?
They introduced the research of Gregory S. Paul, who took a different approach.
Okay.
He compared levels of religiosity in 17 developed democracies
Okay.
and looked at things like homicide rates, STDs, teen pregnancy poverty, things that affect social well-being.
So all these factors that kind of contribute to a society's
Exactly.
overall health. So did he find that more religious societies fared better?
Surprisingly, no. He found a strong correlation between high levels of religiosity and higher levels of social dysfunction.
Wow. So more religion actually correlated with a worse society?
It is.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it complicates the narrative, right?
Yeah, that religion is inherently good
Mm-hmm.
for society.
For sure.
But the author doesn't stop there.
Okay.
They dig deeper into this concept of social capital.
Social capital.
Remind me, what is social capital?
It's like the networks of trust, reciprocity, shared values that exist within a community.
Okay, and I remember Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, talked about
Yeah.
the decline of social capital in America.
Right. People becoming more isolated.
So are they saying that religious communities
Yeah.
can help generate social capital?
Yeah.
Because they provide that sense of belonging, shared values, opportunities for people to connect.
Exactly.
So it's possible that religion benefits society, not because of some inherent moral code, but because it helps create those vital networks of trust and connection
Right.
that hold a community together.
Of course, the author being fair also presents a counter-argument by Frank Sulloway.
Okay.
Sulloway suggests that maybe it's not religion that causes good societies, but rather that bad social conditions drive people to seek solace and meaning in religion.
It's like when times are tough, people are more likely to turn to religion
Yeah.
for comfort and support.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing.
Right.
Which came first?
It's hard to determine causality, right, in these
Mhm.
complex relationships.
For sure. So no easy answers when it comes to the impact of religion on society as a whole.
It seems that way.
Now, shifting gears a bit,
Okay.
the author also explores the question of whether religion is good for individuals.
Right.
Like, does being religious make you a healthier, happier person?
Again, they present a very balanced perspective. They talk about both the benefits and the drawbacks.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's no denying that religious practice can have positive effects on individuals.
No, absolutely not.
Right.
I mean, you think about that sense of community
Yeah.
that we were just talking about,
Yeah.
like having a support network, a sense of belonging,
Mm-hmm.
a shared system of values that can be very comforting and empowering.
Right. And a lot of religions encourage healthy behaviors,
They do.
like, abstaining from smoking or excessive drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the whole, faith can provide a sense of purpose and meaning in life,
Mm-hmm.
which can be incredibly beneficial for mental and emotional well-being.
Absolutely.
But then on the flip side, the author points out that some religious beliefs can be actually detrimental to individual health and well-being.
Right.
They highlight groups that refuse medical treatment in favor of prayer,
Yeah.
like Jehovah's Witnesses who won't accept blood transfusions,
Right.
even in life-threatening situations.
Or Christian scientists who rely solely on spiritual healing.
Right. Those are definitely examples of where religious beliefs can have negative, even dangerous consequences.
Absolutely.
So it's not all sunshine and roses.
It's not. It's important to remember that nuance.
Right.
And approach it with, a balanced perspective.
Now, moving beyond the debate about health and happiness,
Okay.
the author also delves into some interesting research connecting religious practices
Right.
to self-control and willpower.
Okay.
They talk about the work of psychologist Roy Baumeister,
Mhm.
who has done a ton of research on self-control.
Yeah.
And Baumeister found that practices like meditation
Right.
can actually train the brain to be better at resisting temptation and delaying gratification.
It's like strengthening a muscle, but the muscle is willpower.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
So, and the author connects this to religious practices.
They do. They point out that, even if you don't believe in the supernatural aspects, those rituals can still have this positive impact on self-discipline.
Oh,
Things like prayer chanting, ritualistic fasting.
right.
All these things can be seen as forms of mental training.
So even if you're not a believer,
Yeah.
engaging in certain religious practices might still have psychological benefits.
Exact.
That's fascinating.
It is.
Okay, so after looking at the individual effects of religion,
Yeah.
the author turns their attention to something that we often take for granted as a moral foundation,
Okay.
the Ten Commandments.
Right.
They're so ingrained in our culture
Hmm.
that we rarely stop to question them.
But the author challenges us to do just that,
Right.
to really examine them.
I mean, some of them do seem a bit outdated,
For sure.
like, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife.
Right.
It's like, well, that feels a little
Outdated.
out of touch with our current understanding
Yeah.
of relationships and,
Personal autonomy.
personal autonomy.
And what about thou shalt not kill?
Right.
Right.
Is that an absolute moral principle, or are there ever justifiable reasons
Yeah.
for taking a life? And then there's all those things
Right.
that the Bible prescribed the death penalty for.
Oh, yeah.
That seemed pretty minor by today's standards.
Working on the Sabbath, taking the Lord's name in vain. I mean, those are punishable by death.
Like, whoa.
It's hard to imagine those laws holding up
Yeah.
in a modern court of law.
So it highlights how much our moral sensibilities
Yeah.
have evolved.
They have.
So the author's basically saying
Mm-hmm.
that the Ten Commandments, while historically significant,
Yeah.
might not be the best guide for moral decision-making
In the 21st
in
century.
the 21st century.
Right.
So if not the Ten Commandments, then
Right.
what does the author offer an alternative?
They do. They propose something called a provisional rational decalogue.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
Yeah, it's a set of moral principles grounded in reason, scientific understanding, and, open to revision and improvement.
So provisional meaning it's not set in stone,
Exactly.
open to change, and rational meaning it's based on logic and evidence, not just blind faith or ancient traditions.
It's more in line with, how science works.
Right,
You're constantly testing your hypothesis,
right.
updating your beliefs.
So what are some of the principles
Yeah.
included in this rational decalogue?
Well, the first one is the golden rule principle.
Oh, okay, the classic.
Treat others as you would want to be treated.
Right, treat others how you want to be treated.
Yeah.
Seems pretty straightforward.
Well, it's a good starting point, but the author does acknowledge that even the golden rule has its limitations.
Okay, so what are they?
Well, what one person considers, desirable treatment
Yeah.
might not be what another person wants. Like some people enjoy being insulted or teased.
So it's not just about blindly applying the golden rule.
Right.
You have to take into account individual differences
You do.
and the context of this situation.
Exactly.
Okay, so there needs to be more to it
Right.
than just that.
And that's where the ask first principle comes in.
Ask first.
It's a very simple but powerful idea to determine whether an action is right or wrong. Ask the person who will be affected by it.
So simple but profound.
It is.
Instead of assuming you know what's best for someone, just ask.
Exactly.
It sounds like a good way to avoid misunderstandings and unintended harm.
It is.
Okay, I'm liking this approach.
Yeah,
It's about using reason, empathy, open communication.
it is.
What other principles are included in this rational decalogue?
Well, next is the happiness principle,
Happiness principle.
which is based on the idea that we should strive to maximize happiness and well-being, both for ourselves and for others.
Happiness is a guiding principle for morality.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, it's a pretty good goal, right?
So the idea is when you're thinking about a moral action, you consider whether it will lead to more happiness or more suffering
Exactly.
in the long run.
It's about making choices that contribute to a flourishing life for everyone.
But happiness can be subjective, though, right?
It-
What makes one person happy might not have the same effect on someone else.
And they do acknowledge that you have to consider the overall balance of happiness.
Right.
It's not about just maximizing like fleeting pleasures.
It's about making choices that lead to a sense of well-being and fulfillment
right.
for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Okay, so while eating a whole tub of ice cream might make you happy in the moment,
Right.
it's probably not the best choice for your long-term well-being.
Exactly.
I like it. What's next?
Next is the liberty principle.
Liberty principle.
This one centers on the idea of freedom.
Clear.
The freedom to pursue happiness and to make choices that allow us to live authentically.
That seems like a pretty core value in a lot of societies.
It is.
So the idea is when you're considering a moral action,
Yeah.
you ask yourself whether it restricts someone's freedom
Right.
or
Sure.
expands it.
It's about recognizing and respecting people's autonomy
Okay.
and their right to make their own choices.
But doesn't that sometimes conflict with other principles, like the happiness principle?
It does sometimes. You know what? If someone's pursuit of happiness infringes on someone else's freedom,
Right.
and that's why it's a provisional decalogue,
Right. It's not
not a set of absolute unbreakable rules.
right. There's going to be gray areas.
There are always going to be situations where different principles come into conflict.
So it's about weighing the different principles
Right.
carefully. and making the best judgment you can
Exactly.
in each situation.
And that leads us to another principle, the fairness principle.
Fairness. That seems like a pretty fundamental concept.
It is.
So how does the author define fairness in this context?
They put it in a really thought-provoking way.
Okay.
They say, when contemplating a moral action, imagine that you don't know if you'll be the doer or the receiver of that action.
Okay.
And when in doubt, err on the side of the other person.
So it's like you're taking the perspective
Yeah.
of both sides of the equation
Yeah.
and choosing the action that would be most fair, regardless of which role you end up in.
It's a good way to overcome your natural self-serving bias
Right.
and to strive for a system that's fair and equitable for everyone, not just yourself.
It kind of reminds me of John Rawls's veil of ignorance idea,
Exactly.
right? Where he says, like, imagine you're designing a society from scratch, but you don't know what position you'll hold in that society,
Right.
rich or poor,
Healthy or sick.
powerful or powerless.
Powerful or powerless.
And so you're more likely to create a system that's fair
Exactly.
for everyone.
Because you don't want to risk ending up on the wrong side of an unfair system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm really appreciating the depth and thoughtfulness of this rational decalogue.
It's a good framework.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so then the author takes these principles
Yeah.
and applies them to a specific historical example,
Okay.
the fight to abolish slavery,
Right.
which is a perfect example of how deeply ingrained immoral practices can be
Yeah.
and how much effort it takes to overcome them.
It's a case study in that.
So they kind of trace the arc of this moral revolution,
Yeah.
highlighting the crucial role that reason and secular arguments
Yeah.
played in changing hearts and minds.
Right.
Which is interesting because, we often associate the abolition movement with religious groups,
Dude.
especially here in the U.S. The Quakers were really prominent.
Right. They were at the forefront.
But the author points out that for centuries, the Bible itself was used to justify slavery.
Exactly.
It was only really after the Enlightenment,
Yeah.
with its emphasis on reason, individual rights.
And the inherent dignity of all human being?
Right.
Yeah.
That we started to see strong moral arguments against slavery emerging.
So thinkers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, they were really challenging the status quo, using reason to argue for the inherent worth of all people.
Right, regardless of race or social status.
Exactly.
And so their ideas, combined with the tireless efforts of abolitionists, both religious and secular, eventually led to the outlawing of slavery.
It was a joint effort.
And it's a powerful example of how changing ideas, driven by reason and empathy, can lead to profound social change.
And the author emphasizes that moral arguments alone weren't enough.
Right.
It took political action, legal reforms,
Right.
and sadly even war to finally dismantle this institution.
Like the Civil War here in the U.S.
Right.
It's a tragic but ultimately necessary
Yeah.
step in ending slavery.
And even today, the fight against modern forms of slavery, sex trafficking, forced labor, all these things continue.
It's still going on.
It is, and it shows that the pursuit of justice and equality is an ongoing process.
Yes.
One that requires us to be vigilant and to challenge these systems of oppression.
Wherever they exist.
Yeah.
And speaking of interconnected struggles, the author then draws this really interesting line from the abolition of slavery
Right.
to the fight for women's rights.
Yes.
They argue that progress in one area
Yeah.
often paves the way
Oh,
for
true.
progress in others.
Yeah.
And they illustrate this point with the story of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott,
Oh, those two amazing women.
two really key figures in the U.S. women's suffrage movement.
Yeah, pioneers.
And so the author tells the story of how they were inspired to launch the women's rights movement after being barred from speaking
Oh, wow.
at an anti-slavery convention.
They were fighting for the rights of enslaved people, but then realized they themselves were being denied basic freedoms as women.
Right. They were like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We're there fighting for others,
Yeah.
but we ourselves
Right.
don't have these rights.
Exactly.
And so it just shows how expanding the moral circle
Yeah.
to include one group can lead to this recognition that we need to keep expanding it further.
Yeah.
And of course, their efforts, along with countless other suffragists,
Yeah.
eventually led to women winning the right to vote.
It was a huge victory.
But it was a long and difficult battle, wasn't it?
No, it was.
How long did it take for women to get the right to vote in the U.S.?
It took 72 years of activism, protests, political organizing.
72 years. That's a really long time.
It is a testament to their persistence and determination.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And then within the realm of women's rights,
Yeah.
the author tackles one of the most contentious issues of our time.
Okay.
Abortion.
Abortion.
It's an
Yeah.
issue that's often framed in very black and white terms,
It is.
but the author offers a more nuanced perspective.
Okay.
So instead of just arguing life begins at conception versus a woman's right to choose,
Yeah.
they bring in scientific and ethical considerations
Right.
to inform the discussion.
They start by exploring the evolutionary roots of male attempts to control female reproduction.
You're referring to the whole mothers, baby fathers, maybe
Exactly.
dynamic.
Yeah.
So from an evolutionary perspective, men can't be as certain of paternity
Right.
as women can be of maternity.
Exactly.
So throughout history,
Yeah.
there have been attempts to control female sexuality
Right.
and reproduction,
To make sure that the children a woman bears are actually his offspring.
which makes sense from an evolutionary perspective,
Yeah.
but obviously doesn't justify,
Yeah.
controlling women's bodies.
It's an interesting insight into the forces that have shaped our views on reproduction
Right.
and women's bodies.
But it doesn't make it right.
Right.
Okay, so then the author presents some pretty compelling evidence
Okay.
showing that access to contraception is really effective in reducing abortion rates.
It is.
They give examples like South Korea and Turkey, where increased access to contraception led to fewer unwanted pregnancies
Right.
and consequently fewer abortions.
So if the goal is to reduce abortions,
Right.
this seems like a pretty logical approach.
It does make sense.
Right.
If you truly value life, then preventing unwanted pregnancies in the first place
Yeah.
should be a top priority.
The author also debunks the effectiveness of abstinence-only education.
Which is not surprising. I mean,
Mhm.
teenagers are going to experiment sexually,
Yeah.
regardless of what they're told.
They-
Pretending otherwise just doesn't seem like an effective strategy.
They even share a startling statistic from one study that 1 in 200 teenage girls reported getting pregnant without having sex.
Wait, what? How is that even possible?
It just highlights how when you shame young people and you pressure them into denying their sexuality,
Right.
they're less likely to seek out accurate information about contraception and safe sex.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It is.
So then the author shares a really cautionary tale.
Okay.
It's the case of Romania under the dictator Nicolas Ceausescu,
Yeah.
who basically tried to boost the population
Right.
by banning abortion
Yeah.
and restricting access to contraception.
I think we all know how that turned out.
It didn't go well, did it?
Not at all.
What happened?
It led to a surge in unwanted births, abandoned children, dangerous back alley abortions.
It's really sad.
It's tragic.
It just shows how these attempts to control people's reproductive choices
Yeah,
often backfire
they do.
with really devastating consequences.
Policy should be based on evidence and respect for individuals, not on ideology and attempts to control people.
I think that's a really important point.
So after all of that groundwork, talking about contraception
Yeah.
and reproductive rights, the author finally tackles that core moral question of abortion itself.
Right, because that's really what it comes down to,
Yeah.
isn't it?
It is.
So how does the author approach this really sensitive issue?
They challenge that typical pro-life, pro-choice dichotomy.
Okay.
Instead of framing it as a life or no life issue, they suggest looking at it from a different perspective.
So they're moving away from that all or nothing approach.
They are.
Okay, I like where this is going. So what do they suggest?
They introduce this concept of a probability of human life continuum.
Okay, that's interesting. Tell me more about that.
They argue that before conception, the probability of human life is 0.
Okay, makes sense.
At the moment of conception, the probability increases.
Right.
But a fertilized egg isn't a fully formed human being.
Right. It's got the potential,
It
but it's still in those very early stages.
Right, development. And then as that embryo develops into a fetus, that probability of human life gradually increases.
Okay.
And then they bring in neuroscience to support this argument.
Okay.
It turns out it's not until quite late in pregnancy that the fetus develops, the neural complexity needed for consciousness, for feeling pain, for having thoughts and emotions.
So they're basically saying that ending a pregnancy in the very early stages,
Yeah.
before the fetus has developed those capacities,
Right.
is morally different from, ending a pregnancy in the later stages or even killing a newborn baby.
That's their argument.
Okay.
They believe that denying women access to safe and legal abortion, especially in those early stages, is a serious moral failing.
It's a really thought-provoking perspective.
It is.
That moves beyond those kind of simplistic and often polarizing,
Right.
slogans that we hear.
It encourages us to think about, the complexity of human development, the ethical implications
Right,
of our
right.
choices.
Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive.
It has.
We've challenged that assumption that religion is the sole source of moral progress.
We have.
We've looked at the complex relationship between religion and society,
Mm-hmm.
and then we've delved into these really challenging ethical dilemmas,
Yeah.
like abortion, where religious beliefs often clash with individual rights and scientific understanding.
Right.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what are some of the final thoughts that you would leave with our listeners?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that the relationship between religion and morality is far more complex than we often think.
Okay.
Religion has played a role in shaping moral values, but so have other factors: reason, empathy, scientific understanding.
Yeah, it's not as simple as some people want to make it seem.
Right.
And it seems like this whole exploration has really raised more questions than it's answered,
It has.
which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right?
Not at all. Host speaker.
72 years. It's amazing to think that it took that long for women to finally secure the right to vote in the U.S.
It really is.
It just goes to show how deeply ingrained these inequalities can be
Yeah.
and how much effort it really takes to challenge them.
Right. And it's a testament to the dedication of the suffragists who fought so hard for so long.
Yeah, incredible persistence and determination.
And it reminds us that the fight for equality is an ongoing process.
For s-
It requires constant vigilance,
Right.
a willingness to confront injustice wherever it exists.
Absolutely.
And then the author presents some really encouraging data
Okay,
about the progress that's been made in women's rights since the suffrage movement.
that's good. I like positive news.
We've seen big increases in women's economic participation, access to education representation in leadership positions.
That's great to hear.
The pay gap, while still present, is shrinking.
Okay.
And probably most importantly, there's been a notable decrease in rates of rape, sexual assault, and domestic violence.
Wow, that's really heartening to hear.
Yeah.
It shows that societal attitudes and behaviors can shift.
Even on these deeply ingrained issues like violence against women,
It gives me hope that we can continue to move in the right direction.
it's a sign that things are moving in the right direction. But the author does acknowledge that immense challenges remain,
Okay.
particularly in certain parts of the world where women still face severe oppression and discrimination.
You know those horrific practices we were talking about earlier, like honor killings, child marriage, female genital mutilation?
It's heartbreaking to know that these things are still happening.
It is. It's just a stark reminder that we still have a lot of work to do.
Absolutely.
So the fight is far from over.
It's not.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the author then tackles a really complex and contentious issue within the realm of women's rights,
Okay.
abortion.
Abortion.
It's often presented as this black and white issue.
Yeah, with two sides entrenched in their beliefs.
But the author takes a more nuanced approach.
Yeah.
They try to ground the discussion in a scientific understanding of human development.
Right.
So rather than just debating life begins at conception versus a woman's right to choose,
Mm-hmm.
they bring in biological and neurological evidence
Yeah.
to inform the conversation.
They start by talking about those evolutionary roots of male attempts to control female reproduction.
Oh yeah, the whole mothers, baby fathers maybe dynamic
Exactly.
that we were talking about.
Yeah, where men, because they can't be 100% certain of paternity, have historically tried to control, women's sexuality and reproductive choices.
Right, which I guess makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
It does, but of course that doesn't justify it.
No, of course not.
Yeah, no.
Understanding where something comes from doesn't make it right.
Right.
Okay, so then the author presents evidence
Yeah,
that access to contraception is really effective
it is.
in reducing abortion rates.
Yeah. They give examples like South Korea and Turkey, where increased access to contraception led to a huge drop in unwanted pregnancies and fewer abortions.
It just seems logical that if you're really serious about reducing the number of abortions,
Mm-hmm.
then you would want to support access to contraception.
It's about preventing those unwanted pregnancies in the first place.
Exactly.
And the author also points out that abstinence-only education isn't very effective.
Which isn't surprising. Teenagers are curious about sex.
They are.
You could just pretend that they're not
No.
and not give them the information they need.
Exactly. You're just setting them up for failure.
So a more common sense approach would be to provide comprehensive sex education.
Right. Give them the information they need to make informed choices.
So the author then brings up this really disturbing example of what can happen
Okay.
when governments try to control people's reproductive choices.
Yeah.
It's the case of Romania under Ceausescu.
Ceausescu tried to boost the population by banning abortion and restricting access to contraception.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It was a complete
It
disaster.
really was.
What happened?
It led to all these unintended consequences, a surge in unwanted births, lots of children abandoned in orphanages, and a really dangerous black market for illegal abortions.
So it just backfired horribly.
It did.
And it shows, the danger of trying to control people's personal choices.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as fundamental as, reproductive autonomy.
It's a reminder that we need to respect individual rights, bodily autonomy, and people's right to make decisions about their own reproductive health.
Absolutely.
So now the author, having laid all this groundwork,
Right.
finally addresses the core moral question at the heart of the abortion debate.
Okay, this is where things get really tricky.
They do.
So how do they approach this issue?
They challenge the typical pro-life, pro-choice dichotomy.
Okay.
Instead of getting stuck in that life or no life framework, they propose a more nuanced perspective.
Okay, so they're looking for a middle ground.
Yeah, something more complex than just those two extremes.
So what do they suggest?
They introduce this concept of a probability of human life continuum.
Probability of human life continuum.
Yeah.
Okay, I've never heard of that before. Explain that to me.
They say that before conception, the probability of human life is 0.
Right. Okay.
At the moment of conception, the probability increases, but a fertilized egg isn't a fully formed human being yet?
Right. It's got the potential,
It does.
but it's still in those early stages
Exactly.
of development.
And as that embryo develops into a fetus, the probability of human life gradually increases.
Okay.
And then they bring in some really interesting neuroscience.
Okay.
It turns out that it's not until pretty late in pregnancy that the fetus develops the brain complexity needed for consciousness,
Okay.
for feeling pain, for having thoughts and emotions.
So it's not just about being biologically alive.
Right.
There's more to it than that.
Exactly.
So are they saying that, like, ending a pregnancy in those very early stages,
Yeah.
before the fetus has developed those capacities,
Yeah.
is morally different from ending a pregnancy in the later stages or even killing a newborn baby?
That's exactly what they're arguing. They're saying it's just not that simple.
Okay.
And they believe that denying women access to safe and legal abortion, especially in those early stages, is a serious moral failing.
It's a really thought-provoking perspective
It is.
that moves beyond the rhetoric and the slogans.
It forces us to think about the complexity of human development and, the ethical implications of our choices.
Yeah, for sure.
And it also highlights the importance of respecting women's bodily autonomy and their reproductive freedom.
Okay.
It's not about having all the answers.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the complexity and approaching these issues with empathy and compassion.
And being willing to listen to different perspectives.
Exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
It's been a fascinating exploration of the relationship between religion and morality.
And I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is that morality is not this static, fixed set of rules.
Right.
It's not something that's dictated by any one source, whether it's religion or tradition or even science.
Morality is a living, breathing thing.
It is.
It evolves.
Yeah.
It changes.
It's a dynamic process that requires us to think critically, to be empathetic, to be open-minded,
Yeah.
and to grapple with those complex and often uncomfortable truths.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this question.
Okay.
What does this exploration mean for your own understanding of morality?
Right.
How do you reconcile your own beliefs and values with the complexities and the contradictions that we've been talking about today?
It's something to think about
It is.
as we continue to navigate this ever-evolving ethical landscape.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make the world a more compassionate, just, and equitable place.
Couldn't have said it better myself.